In the state of New Mexico, with its timeless, unspoiled vistas, history feels enticingly close, especially in this northeastern corner where the Santa Fe Trail once flowed. I live in a homemade adobe house on my ranch at Watrous, where I run a Mustang sanctuary. Watrous, known as La Junta during trail days, was a strategic meeting place along the trail's route, and numerous wagon ruts cross my property. In the spring of 2018, my horse Fancy, my dog Holly, and I set out to visit as many of the major landmarks along the Santa Fe Trail within New Mexico as we could. Most of the route is now on private land, but wherever possible and with permission from landowners, we were able to ride the old trail at a number of key locations. Many of the intrepid travelers who journeyed across the trail wrote memoirs, diaries, and letters. We will be hearing from some of them throughout this film.
When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, it opened its northern border to trade with the United States. That same year, a Missouri businessman named William Becknell became the first American trader to cross the prairies into New Mexico. With his successful arrival in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Trail was officially opened. Originally, the trail covered almost 1,000 miles, running from Franklin, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. But this gradually shortened as the railroads pushed westwards during the 1870s. Near present-day Dodge City, Kansas, the trail divided into two routes, the Mountain Branch and the Cimarron Cutoff. In this first chapter, we cover the Mountain Branch. Although longer than its desert counterpart, it was favored by many travelers due to its more reliable access to water, and it was considered safer during times of Indian unrest. The mountain route did, however, present one major obstacle: the infamous Raton Pass.
The next day we reached the top just about sunrise, and the finest view perhaps I ever saw met the eye. It is difficult to contrast these pure American landscapes with any other. Everything is on so grand a scale. The most striking feature of the scene was the contrast in tone and color between the view to the north and that to the south. To the north, the outline was cut clear and distinct, and the picture cold and majestic. To the south, there was warmth and richness of color. A light velvety purple haze seemed draped over the stretch of mountains and plain. The one awed, the other attracted. Joseph Pratt Allen.
Worse and worse the road. They're even taking the mules from the carriages this afternoon, and half a dozen men by bodily exertions are pulling them down the hills. And it takes a dozen men to steady a wagon with all of its wheels locked. And for one who is some distance off, to hear the crash it makes over the stones is truly alarming. Till I rode ahead and understood the business, I suppose that every wagon had fallen over a precipice.
Susan Shelby McGoffin.
Once wagon trains had successfully crossed the Raton Pass, the mountain branch headed south, following the line where the high plains met the foothills of the 12,000-foot Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Prior to and during the very early days of the Santa Fe Trail, many tribes roamed this land. Here they set up hunting camps, which included large villages comprising many teepees. Their nomadic lifestyle came under attack once the trail brought businesses and settlers into the area. In common with the majority of the West, Indians were portrayed as hostile trespassers, and clashes were often reported by travelers passing through the region. By the mid-1870s, the buffalo had been more or less wiped out in the southern plains, and the majority of the surviving Indians had already been confined to reservations. Many colorful characters traveled this route and settled in this area of New Mexico. The legendary frontiersman Kit Carson homesteaded in Rayado. And his friend, Lucian Maxwell, eventually became the sole proprietor of the enormous Maxwell land grant.
Mere words are inadequate to picture forth the vast plains which are emphatically the great prairies of the far west. Clothed in the verdant livery of spring, or decked in the more luxuriant robes of early summer, they present the appearance of a sea of grass and flowers. Each passing breeze, as it sweeps over the long grasses, give an undulation to its ridges which is enhanced and heightened by the rapid succession of light and gloom derived from the shadows of flying clouds. Nor are these mighty wilds solitary or untenanted. The buffalo feed over them by the thousands. The timid deer or graceful antelope meet the eye at every turn. George Douglas Brewerton.
Situated near the junction of the two main branches of the Santa Fe Trail, the original Fort Union was built in 1851 to provide protection for travelers along both routes. It also served as a supply depot for the numerous other forts within New Mexico Territory. With the arrival of the railroad in Santa Fe in 1880, traffic along the trail came to a halt. As the frontier became more settled, the need for a fort in the area was no longer cost-effective. Fort Union was eventually abandoned in 1891. At La Junta, a trader named Samuel Watrous opened a store where the two branches of the trail reunited. Named for the Cimarron River in Kansas, the Cimarron Cutoff route is considered by many to be the original Santa Fe Trail. Predominantly flat, it was favored by early traders with their fleets of Conestoga wagons for its shorter distance to Santa Fe. But it had its perils. Known as the desert route, it lacked reliable sources of water and proved to be more hazardous during times of Indian unrest. This was buffalo country. Many travelers recounted tales of vast herds that extended for miles, and of buffalo hunts to provide meat for the camp. Buffalo dung, or chips, were used as fuel for cooking fires in this landscape devoid of trees. The buffalo were also a life-giving resource for the Plains Indians, whom they frequently encountered along the trail. On the featureless plains, where the horizon quivered with mirages, and distance was distorted by an absence of scale, any elevated land became a significant beacon and a navigational aid.
At last, some of the most persevering of our adventurers succeeded in ascending the summit of the Round Mound, which commands a full and advantageous view of the surrounding country. In some directions to the distance of 100 miles or more. Looking southward, a varied country is seen, of hills, plains, mounds, and sand undulations. But on the whole northern side, extensive plains spread out, studded occasionally with variegated peaks and ridges. As the caravan was passing under the northern base of the Round Mound, it presented a very fine and imposing spectacle to those who were upon its summit. The wagons marched slowly in 4 parallel columns, but in broken lines, often at intervals of many rods between. The unceasing crack of the wagoners' whips, resembling the frequent reports of distant guns, almost made one believe that a skirmish was actually taking place between 2 hostile parties. Josiah Gregg.
In 1858, an Englishman named Hezekiah Brake wrote, "The climate was becoming delightful, and when we had rested our mules, cleaned our wagon axles, and bathed ourselves, we felt anxious to push forward to the next camping ground, known to travelers by the trail name, the Wagon Mound. It was about 50 miles to this point, and there was an abundance of water there, entirely free from alkali. In 1850, a mail wagon traveling from Fort Leavenworth was attacked at Wagon Mound. The resulting deaths of 10 men prompted the construction in 1851 of Fort Union, 20 miles to the southwest.
Frightening thunderstorms came up suddenly. They would sweep over us, and away they would go, as suddenly as they had come. When the sky would darken and the forked lightning sent the thunder rolling, the drivers would wheel the wagons so that the mules' backs were to the storm. The prairies would darken, and then would come a mighty clap of thunder, and a sheet of drenching water would fall from the skies upon us. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm would pass away. We would emerge then from the wagons to stretch our cramped limbs and to see the golden sun shining through the scattered clouds. There were also the rainbows. If I'd ever seen rainbows before, I'd forgotten them. The rainbows I love to remember are the ones that spanned the old trail. Marion Russell.
The little farming village of Loma Parda, situated at a U-bend in the Morro River, rose to infamy during the era of the Santa Fe Trail, especially after Fort Union was built in 1851. Along its one main street, surrounded by irrigated fields brimming with crops, were numerous dance halls, saloons and brothels that catered to a ready supply of soldiers, teamsters from the wagon trains, and roving bands of outlaws, card sharks, and cutthroats. In the early days of the Santa Fe Trail, the town of San Miguel on the Pecos River was the first settlement travelers coming into New Mexico encountered. In 1835, a group of San Miguel citizens settled a grassy valley 20 miles to the east, and Las Vegas was founded. It was here, in 1846, that Stephen Watts Kearny, marching into New Mexico with his Army of the West, made his first conquest of the Mexican War, claiming New Mexico as a U.S. territory. At Kearny Gap, originally known as Puertocito de la Piedra Lumbre, the trail leaves the plains behind, following a pass that runs between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the north and extensive tablelands to the south.
Tecolote, the Indian name means owl, had a romantic and mysterious origin. We bought a site for our trading post in 1866 and immediately erected a great stone building that was to be both store and dwelling. The long shelves were piled high with everything under the sun. There were implements, feed, food, household furnishings, clothing, saddles, bridles, harness, and Navajo blankets. There were strings of red peppers and jars of azule, or Indian corn. Marion Russell.
The village at San Miguel is both larger and cleaner than any we have passed. It has a church and public square. This road this afternoon has obliged me to ride on horseback again. I find it quite as agreeable as when in the Raton.
Susan Shelby McGoffin.
We passed this day the ruins of the Pecos church in Pueblo. It is a large adobe, cruciform in shape, built without a particle of iron, the rafters and woodwork elaborately carved with some dull tools. It stands on a hill in a commanding position. I confess I looked at it with intense interest. The first grand monument of the race that once held sway over the entire country. Joseph Pratt Allen. We camped this night on the battlefield of Pigeon Ranch, or Apache Canyon, where the Colorado troops met the Texans on the way to Fort Union. From thence to Santa Fe it is some 20 miles. Joseph Pratt Allen.
Santa Fe was founded in 1610 by Don Pedro de Peralta. It was a distant outpost in an isolated province of New Spain. When Mexico gained independence in 1821, it opened trade with the United States along the Santa Fe Trail. Trail travelers arriving in Santa Fe for the first time were often disappointed by their first glimpse of the fabled city. What at first glance appeared to be piles of unburnt bricks surrounded by cornfields turned out to be adobe houses. This was Santa Fe, the place they had traveled hundreds of dusty miles to see. In 1846, Santa Fe became a U.S. territorial capital after the Mexican War. In 1880, the railroad reached Loma, 18 miles south of Santa Fe. When a spur line was built connecting it to the city, it effectively brought the Santa Fe Trail era to an end.